Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Survey Smarts, Looking Forward to 2023. My name is Maria Sigala, and on behalf of all of us here at Chartis Clinical Quality Solutions, thank you so much for joining us today. This is one of our monthly clinical webinars. This is December, Survey Smarts, Looking Forward to 2023. And January's topic is Doing More with Less, Streamlined Policies and Documentation. Hope you will be able to join. Before we begin, I'll walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. This presentation is designed to be interactive, so please become part of the discussion by typing questions or comments into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Time permitting, we will also call on participants with raised hands, which is located on the reactions menu. Today's session is being recorded and will be available within a couple of days. The handout for today's presentation will be uploaded to the webinar's chat throughout the session for those who joined us late. You'll be able to access the recording and handout by going to chartisquality.com, clicking on Insights, going to our webinar page, then locating the Survey Smarts Looking Forward to 2023 webinar. Our past webinars are also available on our webinar page. If at any time you don't see the slides moving or you're having trouble with the audio, try refreshing your browser first. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We are here to help at any time. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. I'll now turn the floor over to Lisa Eddy, who will introduce herself and the other presenters.
Welcome, everyone. And I just want to say hello to a few of my friends there in the chat. Hey, Ruth, see you there. Just a call out for you. In front of you, you got our cadre of services that we offer with Chartis Clinical Quality Solutions. And we have four main business lines, as you can see here on your left. High Reliability Care Solutions, which is the division right now that's bringing you this webinar. And you'll see on your right, all of the things that we do, well, I shouldn't say all, many of the things we do for organizations, healthcare organizations across the country, everything from regulatory readiness surveys, which are really mock surveys with a little twist to educate your staff with to adverse action, CMS and Joint Commission or other accrediting agency, adverse action response and remediation, infection prevention control. We do a lot of work in the behavioral health space, policy process simplification, and so forth. And then we also, from the Chartis Clinical Quality Solutions, have a very deep medical staff services optimization, which is credentialing, privileging, peer review, education solutions. We have Chartis Workforce Solutions, which is interim staffing. So we bring that full, robust, complex service offering to our clients. Bud. Thank you. So I'm Lisa Eddy. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Compliance and High Reliability, background in nursing leadership, went over to quality compliance, risk management, and into the consulting arena. I'd like to introduce Sherilyn Ashlock, who is our advisory consultant in the clinical compliance and high reliability practice. Sherilyn is joining us today to provide sort of moderation of this webinar, and she's going to be bringing us, along with myself, some perspectives from the field because we've been quite busy. Thank you to CMS and Joint Commission and some of the accreditors and state agencies. And then Bud Pate, who is the Vice President of Content and Learning for Clinical Compliance and High Reliability. And Bud spent many years as a regulator in the state of California, CDPH, California Department of Public Health. So Bud literally opened and closed hospitals, if you will, from a regulations standpoint, and then moved over to Kaiser for 15 years and managed their regulatory readiness and accreditation and licensing division. So he's going to bring a lot of those insights to this webinar today. What we'd like to do right now is find out what sort of an organization do you represent. We want to get to know you a little better. And so we're going to ask you to take this poll in, and you can see there's a ability to, indicate what type of organization that you are. And we have a lot of individuals from hospital or critical access hospitals, great. Psychiatric hospitals, as I said, we're doing a lot of work in that arena. So a lot of what we're talking about will be interesting to you. As we go through this, we're going to talk about the objectives today, understanding the leading causes of immediate jeopardy and condition level findings, immediate threat to health and safety, Joint Commission's wording, immediate jeopardy, CMS. We're going to bring to you the perspective of the surveyors as they look back over 2022 and as they look forward to 2023 and from the survey agencies. And then what can you do to implement simple and effective approaches to changes that are brought on by new requirements? What is it that you need to be doing to do those effectively? And then where to focus your energy and effort before that knock on your door or that call, oh my God, the surveyors are here. What can you do to effectively address that? And then I just want to remind everybody, as we go through this program, the slides in a PDF format are going to be showing up in your chat. They may show up repeatedly because as new people join, they'll need to get those. So just if you see them a couple times, don't pay any attention to that. They're there for you. Here's our representation of the individual organizations. Majority are really hospital, critical access hospitals, psychiatric, and then health system overall, with a few from consulting groups. Thank you, Bud. And then we'll go to our next slide. So we have another poll here. What is the accreditation status of your organization? Are you Joint Commission? Are you one of the other accrediting agencies? You don't have an accreditor, you're just CMS certified? Just let us know about that. It's very helpful so that we all know, oh, Joint Commission seems to be the leader here. Then we have DNV and other accreditor. All right, not accredited, so significant amount, 17%. Okay, thank you.
People aren't seeing that yet. Okay, there we go.
Oh, okay, thanks. So there's your tally from that standpoint. So we are going to talk about, we're going to start out with healthcare broken at the weak points. What's going on in healthcare? Many of you know this already. We actually showed these slides and talked about this a little bit at the in the June webinar that we gave. But so healthcare broken at the weak points. What are the CMS and Joint Commission hotspots? Where do you need to focus your energies, be aware of? And then what can you do to play the long game for sustained compliance? So with that, we'll start with healthcare broken at the weak points. We know that there has been the great resignation. I don't think there's anyone on the call today that has not experienced what happened to us during the pandemic. Staff shortages just have obliterated what our normal operations were during the pandemic. We had 30% of our nurses leaving the profession, but I want to point out, as you go to the next slide, Bud, I want to point out that it's not just nurses that have left the healthcare field. I'm finding this, we're all finding it in our consulting practice. There are people, admissions people, physical therapy, you name it, people are leaving the healthcare institution and leadership. We're just having we're just seeing a lot of that in the industry. What does that mean? What's the result? Well, the safety related metrics are suffering. We're seeing, and hospitals across the country, increase in, your hacks, your CLABSIs, CODIs, MRSA, your ventilated associated events. We're seeing an increase of those. We're doing a lot of work with hospitals in decreasing hacks right now because they've just gotten sort of out of control. And so as we go to the next slide, this is just talking about it's not just that we're seeing it, the government's seeing it as well. And CMS is seeking more authority over the accreditors, talking about CMS wants hospitals, the OIGs encouraging CMS to pressure the accrediting organizations to do special surveys because they know that with the new pandemic and with other issues that are hitting healthcare, there needs to be more regulatory oversight. So leading to the next slide, go back one, Bud, thank you. One thing I want to point out to people, staff shortages in EDs are causing so many problems. And I want to point out, this is where the portal of entry is for most patients, right? So the portal of entry where most people are coming into the hospital, it's broken because of staffing resources. And so the crowded ED waiting rooms are resulting in many, what we're finding, adverse events related to patient deaths, relating to reaction time on behalf of hospitals to address clinical situations. And so those shortages are really being seen in the ED. And I want to point out something that I've seen happening. Sherilyn's and Bud's seen it. Some hospitals, due to staff shortages, they put an inexperienced ED nurse in a triage situation, and they don't have the background and training. So that's something, and we'll go through some of these things that are causing the outcome of some of the increased safety issues that we've seen in healthcare caused by the pandemic and the lack of resourcing. Next slide, Bud. This is just to remind everybody, we've talked about this before in other webinars. CMS issued back in February of 2022 sort of a mandate to the state agencies saying, hey, if you don't get out and start surveying your hospital state agencies, we're going to do it for you and we'll take your funding. So that was a mandate to the state saying, get out there and survey. And guess what? I think they took it seriously because we're seeing so much activity around adverse events, and meaning state agencies are surveying for CMS and they're sort of dropping the hammer. And Bud's going to talk about CMS and Joint Commission hotspots, what we're seeing and what the agencies are telling us that they're going to focus their priorities on. Bud?
Yeah, and before I get into that, thank you, Lisa. Excellent overview. As we get into this, I'm going to be focusing where the data is, sort of looking at where the light is, but I know that we have some DNV accredited hospitals and probably CIHQ or HFAP as well. And so what do we take away from what we're going to talk about for those sorts of hospitals? Well, when we first of all, we don't have as much data for those organizations, so it's difficult to look forward. The best way to look forward is to look in the rearview mirror. However, when we look at DNV, GL, that set of findings is very much like a full book CMS survey. It almost goes right down to conditions of participation. You've got restraint in there. You've got grievances. Not that it's the most severe thing in the world, but it just so happens to be a standard in the Joint Commission, in the CMS conditions of participation. So, but I think the through lead, so a lot of the data we do have is showing you how one organization, not just CMS, but Joint Commission, how that organization is looking at 2023 and the future. And I think the message will be the same, although we'll go through specific hotspots from the Joint Commission later on. The overall principle is the same for the other accreditors out there. But let's start at the funder and the driver of all this. What is CMS finding? And this has not changed in a long time. We are anecdotally seeing an uptick in the severity of these things, just like Lisa was talking about. But when we look at what CMS is finding, remember that for the most part, CMS surveys are conducted by state survey agencies. And for accredited hospitals, they only come out when they get a complaint. So you've got an index case. So that's what this data is showing. It's not a routine full book survey. It is really those for cause surveys. And the top of the list is EMTALA, which really focuses on adverse events or patient safety. Really, when you boil it down, although EMTALA has got its own 65 or so page interpretive guideline, what brings the folks out and what causes significant issues are these adverse events: failure to accept a patient, failure to transfer a patient right away, failure to medically screen, that sort of thing, bad things that happen. Next on there is patient rights and nursing. And we get involved in CMS surveys all the time. And in CMS surveys, we see patients' rights out or nursing, more frequently patients' rights, and almost always that has to do with one or more adverse events that were either reported to the state or were discovered by the state when they're there. Next comes infection prevention, and we're going to be talking a lot about infection prevention that spans all, that issue spans all hospitals, really, and all accreditors have infection prevention issues. And then, of course, there's everything else from CMS's standpoint. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you, hopefully, if you guys know this already, I apologize. I'm going to go over just remedially. You need to be familiar with the website I'm about to show you how to get to. It's called Policy and Memos to States and Regions by CMS. This is a Google search. Just put that term or similar term in there. It will come up. That will take you to this page. You have to do a little bit of futzing with the page, but ultimately you'll get to the most recent memos. And the most recent memo that we found, I haven't looked in the last couple of days, but in preparing for this, the most recent memo was workplace violence. That sort of struck a chord in me because we know that the Joint Commission at least has had a new workplace, and OSHA have been looking at workplace violence recently, especially with the spate of mass shootings. And so, but when I read this carefully, what it really seems to be is the final guidance from CMS on suicide, ligature resistance. And so, and it seems that the Joint Commission, their draft guidance, that seems that CMS, in their draft guidance, I think it was in 2019, before the pandemic hit, was quite detailed and had a one-to-one observation requirement, a lot of other things. Since then, the Supreme Court has said, CMS, you cannot create a new regulation by just putting them in the interpretive guidelines. Whatever you're saying must reflect existing requirements. So as a result of that, and I encourage you to go on the website and look at it yourself, is that their expectations are much less prescriptive. Doesn't mean they're not going to look at it. It just means that the states, when they're coming out for suicidal patients, they would expect an evidence-based system somehow, not necessarily all the loopholes that Joint Commission and others have prescribed in recent years. So we have a lot of data on the Joint Commission, so let's go through what that data is telling us. The best way to predict what's going to happen in the future is to look in the rearview mirror. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because this is the data at the beginning that will form the foundation of our analysis. And as anybody who's Joint Commission accredited knows, that the Joint Commission has, for many years now, invested in this safer matrix. And what they call a higher risk issue or more significant issue is the 6 highest levels, which of threat. Immediate threat to health or safety, that's just immediate threat to life, that's the old term. It's really immediate threat to health or safety. And anything that's high likelihood to harm, or anything that's moderate likelihood to harm, that is either a pattern or widespread. And that amounts to almost exactly 25% of the citations come into that higher. So when you look at the higher probability, you don't have to pay attention. This was 2020 data, came out in 2021, and we'll go through what's on here in a little bit. We've got the same stuff that came out in 2022, looking back at 2021. And the one thing that we noticed here between 2020 and 2021 is that the number of surveys increased slightly by about 23%. There's still low volume, relatively low volume of surveys, but they did go up a little bit in 2021 compared to 2020, understandably so. But the number of citations falling in this higher risk category more than doubled. It went up by 120%. So not surprising, the number of significant findings went up significantly between 2021 and 2022. Then we just got off a meeting about a month ago with the Joint Commission leadership. and they alerted us to what's been going on so far in 2022. And what they shared with us are the top 5 clinical and the top 5 environmental issues. And one of them snuck in here that was a bit of a surprise, and that's the food storage requirement here. And we do think that that's something. But let me, I'm going to go into the next slide here, and let's go through these in a little bit more detail. What are these issues that have been persistent over the years? And that we always need to do. And these are the top 10, the short list, but in fact, there's only 4 real issues here. If you took by far the highest cited area there is infection prevention. So the disinfection cycle, IC 221 EP2. The storage of those equipment and supplies, EC 221 EP4. Then environmental, sanitation, maintenance, that sort of thing, 221 EP2, and then temperature, humidity, and airflow in critical locations is up there as well. So that's the infection prevention cluster that we don't see that abating at all. We see that continuing, and that's why we're going to talk about a little bit later what we can do for not only high reliability, but a specific example of that is for infection prevention. So we'll be spending some time on that to help you prepare for 2023 and beyond. The next cluster there is a couple of miscellaneous environmental care, the eye wash stations, and unsafe environmental conditions. EC 261 EP1 sort of flops over into infection prevention when you get into USP 797 and the sterile compounding requirements. But there's a couple of EC issues that we see cropping up in that data. And then, of course, we got suicide, ligature resistance, suicide screening and assessment, and then precautions. This is continuing, and we just got a call 2 days ago that this is one of our clients that we had, warned that this was going to be an issue. Sure enough, is a very major issue still with the Joint Commission. Now CMS and the other accreditors. Let's talk about that a little bit. So on suicide precautions, like I said, CMS, their guidelines are much more general. But that doesn't mean that the state survey agencies aren't looking at that very carefully. So it's more important than ever to say what you do and do what you say.
Hey, Bud.
With respect to suicide. Yeah.
Just a couple things on this. And I think Sherilyn can speak to this as well. We've been heavily involved with both acute care hospitals, with EDs, with behavioral health patients, and freestanding psychiatric hospitals, and with intake areas and so forth. And this, whether it's a state agency surveying for the state or CMS, or it's an accrediting agency, the surveyor's mindset is the same. You have to protect that patient population, and how you do that. CMS is very prescriptive, and if you go to the consistent interpretation discussion and perspectives, you can
Joint
find
Commission.
Yeah, Joint Commission, sorry. Very prescriptive. You can find that in perspectives, but it's been my experience, and I'm sure yours as well. While CMS is somewhat loose with their language, there's an expectation that you've got your eyes on that patient and you're monitoring that patient carefully if they're high risk for suicide. So I just want to point that out. That is getting heavily hit. There's a big focus on that.
And Sherilyn, feel free to chime in too. The thing about this is this has been around for 3, 4, or 5 years that there's been this focus on this stuff. And when we go in, almost every time, people have not fixed this. They have really not fixed it. And it's because, part of it is a staffing issue. If you have to immediately manufacture a sitter who's trained and deploy them whenever you run into a high-risk patient, that's a challenge, staffing-wise. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I'll just share. We're surveying a hospital or doing a readiness review, and I see somebody in surgical garb sitting in a patient's on a med-surg floor bedside. I'm like, that's weird. So I ask, hey, what are you doing here? And the person said, well, I'm sitting with this patient. I said, because they're a fall risk, suicide. What the person didn't know. They called the person from surgery to come down and sit with the patient. I checked with the charge nurse. The patient was suicidal. And this person monitoring was like a scrub tech or something. And of course they had to change their garb and whatever, but when they went back, but I was kind of stunned by that. But it's sort of a metaphor for what's going on in healthcare in terms of staffing, as you mentioned. So we have to be on top of that.
Right. And for, like they say, for Joint Commission are pretty prescriptive, but for CMS and state agencies or even other accreditors like DNV, you just have to say what you do and do what you say and make sure that it's the right thing to do. I mean, the reality of suicide in hospitals is that they're very infrequent. And so, but that doesn't mean we don't need to protect them. So just think about it, do the right thing. And then if you're Joint Commissioner accredited, we'd have to somehow solve this one-to-one. And on the one-to-one observation, so that, and for those of you who are not Joint Commissioner accredited, what the Joint Commission requires, if they are screened by nursing to be at high risk using a Columbia scale or similar scale, if they're screened to be at high risk, then automatically you either put them in a ligature resistant environment without other safety hazards, or you have them one-to-one in the non-ligature resistant environment. And that stays in effect until somebody comes along and says, well, yeah, they're at risk, but right now they're not highly suicidal, so they can be on moderate precautions. We can look at them a little bit later. One of the big issues we see that's driving this too is that folks are doing a Columbia scale on people who come in with a sprained wrist. Remember, you don't have to do this for anybody other than behavioral health complaints. If that's the reason it brought them in, that's the only time you have to do this Columbia screening. And we find that when you're doing this screening, for whatever reason, there's a lot of false positives. Now, that doesn't take away critical thinking from the nurse to say, you know, this person seems to be acting odd, you know, maybe we should look at this more carefully. But to do it for everybody is driving up the number of one-to-ones and causing, and it's just exacerbating. This is a difficult issue, but I know that that we don't have a handle on it as an industry. You have any thoughts, Charlene?
Yeah, I was going to share just some examples of how we've handled this in some of the regulatory rehearsals we've done. So definitely an issue out there. I think it's one of those kind of downstream effects play into those issues and sort of those upstream effects of decisions that were made to do multiple or screening on maybe patients that don't necessarily present. But just anecdotally, let me share an example. I went to an organization a couple of months ago to do a regulatory rehearsal. And one of the things we rehearsed was that safety briefing that is supposed to happen when the survey team presents. And the first thing that they shared with me was, well, I'm not sure we really want to tell you this, but in our current state today, we have 173 patients in our emergency departments in two hospitals. This is a 2-hospital system that are waiting on beds. So they were holding 173 patients in their relatively large, but certainly not that large emergency department. So, you know, that immediately for me as sort of the mock surveyor put some perspective into what that environment was going to be like. And then secondly, in that group of 173 patients, 35 of them were at high risk for suicide or had screened to require a one-to-one observer with them. Well, that is a staffing crisis in itself in the moment. And it was just a staffing crisis that they weren't able to meet. And so we talked through, you know, how are you going to mitigate this during survey experience? How are you, you know, bringing the right providers in to do an assessment and make a decision about, could this be a 2-to-1 observation? Could we group people together? Could we, it is an extremely difficult challenge out there in organizations, but I wanted to bring that kind of to light because it actually was a very helpful piece of information to share during that briefing because it really did put some perspective. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to make a surveyor more compassionate about those guidelines, but it does change the frame of mind in which you kind of walk into that environment and understand the stress of that.
Yeah,
those departments.
it's a situation you have to appreciate.
Situational
That.
awareness.
I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that would sort of downplay that strain on staffing is to create a ligature safe environment, and it doesn't, don't have to go overboard. I mean, just you make a cohort of rooms into a ligature resistance. It's really not that hard.
So it actually was the solution that this organization in one of their emergency rooms had come up with, where they had cordoned off a section of their waiting room to make it completely ligature resistant and placed a group of patients in there. But they still required observation, and
sure, they still require observation, but they don't have to be one-to-one if they're in a ligature resistant.
Exactly.
They can be, so that's interesting. Well, thank you guys. The next thing that's there is really standalone, and it's medication administration, and this is one of those ones that part of these issues are just due to the complexity of titrated medications, and we could talk about that a little bit. And part of the issues is we've shot ourselves in the foot over the years, totally, even though it's not required by CMS, even though it's not required by the Joint Commission, people have outlawed range orders. And as a result of that, they say for a score, and then of course, there is no, your 7 and my 7 are totally different things. And so they've taken nursing judgment out of that. And what they end up doing is citing you if they have a pain score of 6 and you gave them, 10 milligrams, you gave them 2 pills instead of 1, they cite you, or the other way around. If they're a 7 and you didn't give them the higher end, they cite you for it. It's totally unrealistic. Makes sense maybe from a pharmacy standpoint. It does not make sense at the bedside. And that's why people are falling over this. But that's not the only thing on medication administration. It's one of the highest ones that's cited is really around pain management. And so really look at that from a common sense. But there's also these titration issues. What Lisa or
I'll share with you. We frequently see, and we've had hospitals cited. So you're doing cabbages or whatever, and your PACU's closed, and you just choose to recover patients in your your SICU, your surgical intensive care unit, and the patient has a titration order for, say, propofol, and anesthesia and circulator brings the patient to the ICU, and the order is specific, and it says start at this many mics, blah blah blah. And when you get the patient, they're way higher than what the titration, per every 3 to 5 minutes, whatever, because on the ride over, we know that the patient's going to be hyperstimulated. And so, of course, when the nurse gets the patient with the propofol hanging, it's much higher than the prescribed time period and starting dose and whatever, as an example. But we go in, and Sherilyn can attest to this as well. I have not yet picked up a medical record in a critical care unit where I'm looking at titrations, and the titrations have not been in some way the order, so many mics or so many milligrams per kilogram per hour have been breached. I mean, they simply are. And so we really want to look at what's causing that, why. Many times that's due to just simple documentation. As a critical care nurse myself, it's very hard to, you're titrating 2 different patients at, you got 2 patients, you're titrating drips carefully. It's very hard to go in and document precisely when you're doing things per every 3 minutes. And so the Joint Commission has relaxed and allows some block charting for that. There's rules around that, but those are some of the reasons. Sherilyn, what are you seeing? Same thing?
Yeah, I agree. I see the same thing. I think probably what digs the hole a little bit deeper is I never find it right in the record. And then we start to talk to the staff member. And that is a real opportunity, I think, for coaching in the moment as you prepare for survey, is how to talk through titrations with your particularly clinical nurses who will likely be interviewed at the bedside, because, I too have a critical care background. We all know how this happens. but really coaching them through the way that order is written, why that order matters, and the sequential order that it's written in, et cetera, is absolutely critical to prepare your staff, because that rabbit hole can get really, really deep in that interview process with that staff nurse as they're navigating records of surveyors.
Yeah, and really, really fast. And I do want to, and I know Bud's got to move on to the slides, but I do want to point out, for those of you that are Joint Commission accredited, there is some flexibility, and that's been talked about over 2022 with block charting. And as a critical care nurse, I can tell you that's one of this, your nurses are going to like that. You're going to get some capital there with your nursing staff, but it also helps protect you from some of the citations that occur with titration, because a lot of times they're due to documentation.
And CMS is not that prescriptive. They don't get into titrations. And so as long as you do what you say what you do and do what you say on that, the block charting may be a good way to go. And also there is some, for pressors and sedatives and things like that, they allow a lot of nursing judgment to come in there. Although they're working with the Critical Care Nursing Association to just balance the severity of that. So anyway, that's still something we're looking at. So those are the four things really that continue to come up, and most of these aren't. So anyway, infection prevention is the one through line, I think, between all of the accreditors and all agencies. So you have to make sure that emergency power is good. Now, recently on food sanitation, we have actually encountered immediate threats to health and safety because of a dirty kitchen and a poorly maintained kitchen, and food sanitation, which is really an infection prevention. And you saw that cropping up in the top 5 on the for some reason Joint Commission called the clinical side. And when we have dealt with this food sanitation issues before, it's really a matter that it wasn't a priority for the organization. And so they went with the concept of the lowest bidder, and then they continued to save money for the clinical setting by shorting oversight of and general sanitation in the kitchen. And so that is, I mean, again, immediate threat to health or safety behind a dirty kitchen. Imagine that. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of condition level deficiencies. I mean, leadership leads to gets hit for any time you have a condition level finding. We talked before about all the psych patients waiting for psychiatric hospital beds, and at the same time, the Joint Commission and CMS are focusing down on enforcement at psychiatric hospitals. So the psych hospitals and psych units are getting compressed from both sides. Increased regulatory scrutiny, increased behavioral health issues in the population, decrease in non-hospital settings and social settings for doing this, and an increase in regulation. So it's a perfect storm, and we encourage you to start working on that. Again, we'll talk a little bit about playing the long game on these things. You're not going to solve the psychiatric problem in the next week, but it's something that needs to be on your list. Workplace violence. Why is that a projected issue? Well, it's been a year since the Workplace Joint Commission. This is really only a Joint Commission issue. For non-Joint Commission, it's an OSHA issue, but OSHA has sort of backed off on the enforcement of this. However, we've noticed that in the press, there's a lot of ink paid to mass shootings and the like. And so if you're Joint Commission accredited, we put out, and if you need this, let us know, we put out an implementation of workplace violence, but it's all about, and we'll talk about what this and some other new standards that are coming on board, what these things look like. But one of the key points is you have to be data-based. How many incidents of workplace violence do you have? What are they like? You need to do a big data analysis and have a plan ready within the next 2 weeks. of this year in order to comply. And I do see Sylvia's question there, and let me get to that. Maternal safety is something that I know we're working through. I think it makes a lot of clinical sense, but we do expect, especially with health equity coming in, that we look at and make sure that maternal safety is there.
And but they did, Joint Commission just in their online notification, they have a case study on maternal safety and health equity. So that's
Right.
interesting.
So maternal safety is going to be caught up. It'd be a specific example of the health equity issue.
Exactly.
Then we've got the new emergency management standard. Sylvia asks, are there any specific leadership citation trends also specific to QAPI? Well, you know, QAPI and leadership are sort of secondary. In other words, by virtue of the fact that you have a problem with infection prevention, your leadership is at fault and QAPI was at fault. The biggest, and so QAPI is almost always a big deal, certainly in CMS findings. When there's a significant finding somewhere else, they'd be reflective in QAPI. The biggest change in the QAPI requirements are the individual rolling add-ons. Like there was first the pain management measurement issues that came out. Then there's the antibiotic stewardship measures that ran out. Then there's the workplace violence measures that come out, because that's expected to be in your QAPI program. And then the health equity is part of your QAPI and leadership program. So whenever there is a serious issue, leadership is cited. And that's every time. A lot of the time, QAPI is cited because they didn't identify, or they had indicators that they hadn't addressed proactively, if that makes sense. Do you agree with that, guys?
Oh,
I do.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to share that, you know, I think we talked a little bit about the kitchen situation. Well, in that situation, there was also a QAPI citation because measures were not maintained at the organizational level. So it's just something to think about as you build, maybe going into the next year, your QAPI plans, understanding the responsibility of needing to have oversight and measurement metrics associated with anything that touches a patient, including those areas that we often forget, like our kitchens and our, you know.
Well, and our QAPI departments are really, their focus is on the U.S. News and World Report and the hacks, and that's a huge. That's a big rock that needs to be rolled up that hill. Yep. And so where they tend to get hit is the underlying just basic hitting and grounding type
Yep.
of stuff, like food sanitation or suicide. I know that suicide we're probably looking at, but there's a lot of other things. So that's what we're seeing, and hopefully that helps Sylvia. So now, again, we have a lot of data, but I think this is reflective of all survey agencies. There's been a marked increase in the number of immediate threats to health or safety. And the importance of that will come forward here in the next 5 minutes or so. I'm running a little bit long. So, but suffice it to say that in 2024, there were only 4 immediate threats to health or safety out of that top 10. 2021, it went up significantly. What is that? 6 times. And so far in the first three quarters of 2022, it's already at 50. So Joint Commission, at least, and survey agencies have a very hair trigger on immediate threat to health or safety. CMS would call it immediate jeopardy. Same idea. Workplace violence, we talked about that's a full year. I'm going to talk about it. And then as far as survey scheduling goes, we talked to Joint Commission about that. And as of last week or week before, they're still playing catch up on hospital surveys through the first quarter of 23. And that target keeps moving down down the line for some reason are having difficulty catching up. And another issue is that they don't have life safety specialists, enough of them. So when that happens, they'll come and they'll give you the clinical findings, and then once the life safety findings come in a week later, 2 weeks later, or beyond, then the report will become final. Obviously, that wouldn't apply to immediate threat to health or safety, but any other thing, the report is not final until that second stage is done. Now, the safety briefing that came out in Perspectives a little bit ago really is, I misunderstood it, and I think a lot of hospitals, but they were very clear at the Joint Commission that this is supposed to be just for surveyor awareness. It's not scorable. It's just, do you require, a Joint Commission will be wearing masks, surveyors will be wearing masks, and that's been the mandate. But are there places that you have that are less secure? Is there a threat of a strike? That kind of thing. It's a 5-minute conversation at the beginning, and it's not scorable. But what is scorable, and again, I'm not sure how this feeds over into CMS and the others, is dirty glucometers. Believe it or not, if you've got more than one dirty glucometers, in fact, in some cases in the past, they've done it for just one, they're talking about immediate threat to health or safety.
And I just want to point out, this isn't just our like, oh gee, we found this. This is the Joint Commission making this statement. We're a part of a group of consulting firms that meet with the Joint Commission quarterly, and this is what they told us. Right.
And also, they're finding spoons and crochet needles in surgery, being used in surgery. I mean, I'm not talking about a surgical grade spoon or knitting needle, something you get, but something you get from Bionida, a spoon, or at Hobby Lobby, and that's an immediate threat. And I know that. And let me just move on because I'm running a little bit short. And then there's some 797 revisions that are going on. And while the health equity requirements are new, and all of the new requirements that are coming out tend to follow this pattern. You appoint a responsible individual, you create a group, you collect data, you develop a plan. Now there's beaucoup information on the Joint Commission's website about health equity. I encourage you to look at that carefully, because they'll be by the end of the year, all of these things need to be in place here. And they've used this for antimicrobial stewardship. That's the way they rolled that out. Workplace violence, and now health equity. And in the future, they're looking at carbon neutral standards and things like that. So again, the health equity standards sort of mirror that. There's too much information to go through on health equity. That's probably in its own webinar. But I will tell you that when you think about which groups are we looking at, and what you're going to do is you're going to take your existing data and cut it by at-risk groups. So what is the highest at-risk group? The elderly. What's the next highest? Women. What's the next highest? Non-English speaking. What's the next highest? African American. We tend to have good data on the, like maternal safety is very good. If you look at that across your social economic groups, that looks good. But that's what they're expecting you to do, is to look across those groups, pick one area where you're going to make improvements and make those improvements. And I know that's a very short shrift here. But I wanted to really start talking about playing the long game and not just preparing for survey. The Joint Commission and is in particular has developed over the last decade and change the SAFER methodology, where they could distinguish between more important issues and less important issues, which is good. And then they've developed this consistent interpretation around high reliability leadership. And what that means is that at some point going forward, they've been just giving these bad citations, and people usually get condition level findings. and they just go on in 3 more years. But at some point, and people are starting to get preliminary denial of accreditation. And as you know, any immediate threat to health or safety, there's 50 hospitals right there that are looking at preliminary denial of accreditation. But there are other people who've maybe had the same issues from year to year to year, still had infection issues. Who doesn't have infection issues? Raise your hand. I didn't think so. Don't bother. So you continue to have those same issues, survey after survey, then you get this preliminary denial. And then they come back as early as 18 months. So your window is shortened, cut in half for the next full survey. And if they find another issue that triggers preliminary, there is no more preliminary denial of accreditation, it's denial of accreditation. And this is done on purpose by any survey agency. No survey agency can afford the reputation of you pay your money, you get your accreditation. They have to distinguish between those that deserve accreditation and those that do not. So this is the Joint Commission's method. So what does that mean? It means we have to look at high reliability, and because we feel that compliance is a byproduct of high reliability. It doesn't sit alone. And so it needs to balance efficiency, quality, and safety. It's that sweet spot. If something is done, excuse me. I'm sorry about that. I hit the wrong button. Let's try it again. So, oh, come on, bud. I shouldn't put all these bills in there. Anyway, the bottom line is that there we go. That a lot of times things are done in the name of quality that aren't efficient or particularly safe, although most of them are safe, or things are done in safety that are not efficient or yield to satisfaction or quality, or efficiency in particular. Some things, but we've all known that high reliability is all, and by the way, some survey findings don't do anything. We try and meet them without even paying attention. Is this improving operations? Is it making people more safe? Is it improving quality? Well, we can't, that will not sustain. And through that and other high reliability concepts, we need to sustain compliance over the long run if we're to remain accredited. So I've developed this slide recently. I've spent time in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, and really cool getting up close and personal to icebergs. And we've all heard the metaphor below the surface, beneath the surface of an iceberg. Does anybody want to take a guess as to how much of an iceberg is actually underwater? Well, I hit the button too soon. You don't have to guess. It's 89%, 90% roughly. So 90% of that iceberg are not visible to surveyors, are not visible, but they result in and they support the things that are visible. If you're doing really well and you're in the top 10 in Business US News and World Report, there's 90% of the effort that is behind that. It's a huge journey. And if you're having a bad survey, again, there's 90% that's below the surface that you're not doing in order to protect safety and ensure compliance. And even if you remove what's visible, there's still 90% below the surface, which is what sunk the Titanic, right? So what do we mean by that? A sample of important tactics that lead to high reliability and sustain. There's alignment, priority setting, and collaboration. There's oversight, accountability, management. There's documentation simplification. I mean, my goodness, how could a nurse document or communicate with a physician if they're spending all their time blowing through hard stops and check marks? Adverse events management is very important. I mean, this is an entire subject unto itself, but process maturity much more. This is what we as an organization specialized, yes, we will come and chip away at the surface of the iceberg. We know what it is. And in fact, if you're in serious trouble, we will get you out of trouble 100% of the time. We have never failed to get you out of trouble. But if you're to avoid that trouble, you need to be focusing on what is below the tip of that iceberg and be looking at these things. You guys want to talk about that briefly?
But,
I'm gonna blow through. Yeah.
But we just have 5 minutes left, but I want to point out the fact that when we talk about that, oversight and accountability is huge for an organization, and priority setting and coordination, huge, and also adverse events management. So if I have an organization in trouble, I guarantee you that I'll go in there and I'll find out that we have people that are not aligned with the go forward for organizations. They're misaligned in many silos. The accountability is generally weak, or we have communication that does not filter to the appropriate individuals as it should. And then adverse events management, that's where we see many hospitals getting into trouble. They don't have a good, they collect incidents all you want, but they don't really have a good sustainable way of focusing on triaging severity events. And so, as Bud said, that's a whole webinar in and of itself, but that underneath the iceberg is these things that are on the screen are huge. But again, I'm going to focus on the organization has to set priorities and coordinate them across the organization. And there has to be oversight and accountability, or any of the other things that follow. You won't sustain.
Yeah, a quick war story there. Dr. Andrew Resnick, who is the leader of our high reliability practice, tells a story about a client that they went into, and the HR department had entered into an algorithm where the first time somebody is involved in an adverse event, a nurse is involved in an adverse event, they get suspended. And the second time or third time, I don't remember which, they get fired. And so the HR director was saying, wow, that's been a huge success. Look at all the adverse events that have gone down, which is so wrong. I mean, you know what's going on there. Nobody's reporting. Why would you report? Why would you, if you know that you're going to get suspended? That's not, now we know we talk about just culture, but it's so important as one of the underlying, but there's many things. It's a journey, not a destination. I'm going to just go on here to the end. Any closing thoughts that you have? I was going to talk about infection prevention. If you want to see our story of infection prevention, we just finished an online webinar, and please get into our website and take a look at that. It talks about all this in detail. And how we look at the maturity of a program, and we apply these principles of alignment, prioritization, just culture, adverse events management, meeting management, documentation management. We all put those into specific things. So instead of working on the whole thing, you might want to select infection prevention, suicide, or your hacks if you've got a high number of hacks from a quality standpoint, and apply this system that we've approached that we call maturity modeling, so that we can give you feedback on an ongoing basis as to how you're doing. We don't have any time. Do you have closing thoughts, Sherilyn and Lisa?
Well, I'll let Sherilyn start if you'd like.
Sure. I just grateful for everyone's attendance today. I hope that you found some insights that might make you, as you look forward to 2023, survey ready, and know that we're here to help you if that is an interest of you at all. I think the golden thread sort of throughout this starts with where, we see kind of the onslaught of downstream effects from the pandemic, that a lot of those are visible at the surface, but if you look underneath, the impact that it's making in patient care and the ability to be highly reliable is increasingly challenging for organizations across the country, which makes it more and more and more important for us to work through strategies for efficiency, recognize and honor each other's best practices and share those practices. And so it's nice to be part of a community that is willing to do that. So thank you all for your participation today.
Well said, Sherilyn. I do want to just tag on one thing to what you said. I think it's critically important because, as you know, I've been on the road with you as well. And so we're just beat. But one of the things that we're finding that hospitals are not doing because of the lack of resources is looking at downstream impact. They're making decisions, sometimes in a silo, sometimes because of external pressures put on them by survey agencies, and they make decisions where there is not careful thought put to downstream impact, and the downstream impact causes additional patient safety issues and more work for the hospital. So that key component of operational efficiency, safety, and quality, that triad is so important to think about whenever you're implementing or revising processes. So with that, Bud, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, actually, I'm just going to hand it to Maria to conclude, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you all. Good to see some friendly faces, or note them. Hard to see them.
Maria?
Fantastic. That is all the time that we have for today. I want to thank Lisa Eddy, Sherilyn Ashlock, and Bud Pate, and all of you for a lively and informative discussion on this important subject. As we mentioned, the Chartis Clinical Quality Solutions team will follow up with a response to any questions we did not get to during this Q&A. To learn more about the content presented today, please fill out the post-webinar survey. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.